In the summer of 1200 BC, the city of Hattusa burned, not sacked by a conquering army, not reduced stone by stone in a long siege. The great capital of the Hittite Empire, a city of temples and storehouses and royal archives, was abandoned by its own people and then set alight. The gates were left open, the palaces were stripped before the fires were lit. Whatever was coming, the people who lived there saw it coming, and they left. And then one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world simply ceased to exist. The Hittites had ruled Anatolia, the vast plateau that is now modern Turkey, for over 4 centuries. They had fought Egypt to a standstill. Their kings had written to the pharaohs as equals, addressing them as brother. They had fielded armies of thousands, built cities in stone, developed legal codes of remarkable sophistication, and negotiated treaties whose clay tablets we can still read today. This was not a marginal power on the edge of the ancient world. This was one of its centers, and it vanished so completely that for more than 2,000 years the world forgot it had ever existed at all. It was only in the 19th century, when archaeologists began to pull inscribed tablets from the ruins of Hattusa, that scholars slowly reconstructed what had been lost. The Hittites had to be rediscovered. An empire that had once rivaled Egypt had to be remembered from scratch. This is the descent of the Hittites. And like every descent we study on this channel, the end is not where it appears to be. The collapse did not begin with the fires. It began decades earlier, in the quiet accumulation of pressures that the empire could not see and could not contain. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what the Hittite Empire was at its height. By 1300 BC, Hatti, as the Hittites called their kingdom, was one of the 2 undisputed superpowers of the ancient world. Its territory stretched from the Aegean coast in the west to the upper reaches of the Euphrates in the east, south into the Levant, where it pressed against the borders of Egypt. Hattusa, the capital, sat on a high plateau in central Anatolia, a city of monumental gates carved with lions and sphinxes, of great temples to the storm god Teshub, of vast grain storage complexes that could sustain the population through lean years. The Hittite state rested on a sophisticated structure. It was not simply a military machine, though its military was formidable. It was a diplomatic and administrative empire. Vassal states throughout the Levant paid tribute and sent their princes to Hattusa as hostages, ensuring loyalty. The Hittites wrote and enforced treaties with remarkable precision, and the clay tablets of their royal archives record everything from diplomatic correspondence with Egypt to instructions for horse training, medical texts, and ritual procedures. Most significantly, the Hittites controlled the trade routes that connected the eastern Mediterranean world. Tin came through their territory. Iron, which the Hittites appear to have worked and guarded jealously, gave them a technological edge. Their ports connected to the broader Bronze Age trading network. They were not apart from that connected world. They were one of its pillars. At its height, this was a state of genuine complexity and reach. It had survived internal succession crises, wars with Mitanni to the east, and one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. In 1274 BC, the Hittite king Muwatalli II led a force of tens of thousands against the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II at the Battle of Kadesh on the Orontes River, in what is now Syria. Neither side won decisively. Both sides later claimed victory. But what followed was remarkable. Rather than continue the war, Egypt and Hatti signed a formal peace treaty. The text of that treaty, written in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, still exists. It is the oldest surviving written peace treaty in history. An empire capable of that was not a brittle thing. It had endured, it had adapted, it had survived, and then, within roughly 2 generations, it was gone. The traditional explanation, the one that shaped historical understanding for most of the 20th century, pointed to the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples were a loose coalition of migrants and raiders who appeared across the eastern Mediterranean around the end of the 13th century BC. Egyptian records describe them in vivid, urgent terms, coalitions of foreigners sweeping down from the north and from the sea, burning cities, toppling kingdoms. The pharaoh Ramesses III recorded his wars against them on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, in texts that describe a world in motion, peoples uprooted, no land able to stand before them. The Hittite Empire, the story went, was their victim. The empire was attacked, overwhelmed, burned, and erased. The Sea Peoples were the cause, case closed. But the evidence does not support a clean verdict. For one thing, the Sea Peoples were not a unified invading army with a homeland and a command structure. They were a diverse collection of groups, some of whom may have originated in the Aegean, some in Anatolia, some possibly in regions further north, and scholars continue to debate their origins. Crucially, many of them appear not to have been conquerors at all, but refugees. Populations already displaced, already in motion, not because they chose to raid, but because something had already gone wrong in the places they came from. More telling still are the specifics of Hattusa's end. When archaeologists excavated the capital, they found no mass graves, no signs of a population killed in place. The palaces were stripped before the burning, valuables were removed. The fires appear in some areas to have been set deliberately, possibly by the inhabitants themselves, destroying what they could not carry. This is not the picture of a sudden, overwhelming conquest. This is something else. This looks like an evacuation, which means the question is not who burned Hattusa. The question is what had already made Hattusa unlivable. There was no single cause. Begin with the climate. In recent decades, paleoclimatological research has built a compelling picture of prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Pollen cores, isotope analysis of ancient wood and sediment, the evidence converges. Rainfall declined. Harvests failed. The Hittite plateau, which was never the most fertile land, would have felt this acutely. The clay tablets make this visible in concrete terms. A series of letters found at Ugarit and other sites from the final years of the Bronze Age system include desperate requests for grain shipments. One letter from the Hittite king to Egypt is among the most striking documents of the ancient world. It reads, in its essence, as a plea. The king describes his land as facing famine. He asks for grain. He says the situation is a matter of life and death. This is the king of one of the 2 great superpowers of the age, writing to his equal, not about military alliance or diplomatic ceremony, but about the need to feed his people. Famine does not have to destroy a state by itself, but famine weakens everything it touches. It depletes the workforce that builds and repairs infrastructure. It undermines loyalty to a central authority. It drives migration. It creates the conditions in which secondary pressures become fatal. And those secondary pressures were already accumulating. To the east and southeast, the Assyrian state had been growing in power and assertiveness for decades. The Hittites had managed this threat through a combination of military pressure and diplomacy. But managing an aggressive neighbor requires resources, armies in the field, garrisons along long frontiers, resources that were, by the final years of the empire, increasingly scarce. Within Anatolia itself there is evidence of growing pressure from groups the Hittite texts call the Kaska, tribal peoples from the mountainous north who had raided Hittite territory throughout much of the empire's history. The royal archives record generation after generation of campaigns against them, temporary suppressions, renewed incursions. By the late period of the empire, those raids were intensifying. The frontier was eroding. And then there was the structural fragility built into the Hittite state itself. The empire held together through a network of vassal relationships, local rulers who maintained their positions by loyalty to Hattusa and the threat of Hittite military response if they defected. This system worked when Hattusa was strong. It was always vulnerable to any signal of weakness. As famine reduced the empire's capacity to project force, as the military was stretched across multiple frontiers, as grain stores ran low and the central court became less capable of rewarding loyal vassals with the gifts and protection they expected, the logic of continued loyalty began to break down. Vassal states in the Levant were already watching the broader system destabilize. Ugarit, the great trading port on the Syrian coast that had long operated within the Hittite sphere of influence, was sending and receiving desperate communications in the very years of Hattusa's collapse. Its own end came around the same time, and in similar fashion. There is a letter found baked hard in the ruins of Ugarit, never sent, describing enemy ships sighted offshore, the country undefended, help urgently needed. We do not know what answer came. We only know the city burned and was never rebuilt. This is the mechanism of systems collapse made visible. The Hittite Empire was not one state in isolation. It was a node in a network. When that network began to fail, when trade routes were disrupted, when refugee populations set other populations in motion, when the grain that the Hittite king needed from Egypt moved more slowly or not at all, the empire did not just face its own problems, it absorbed the shocks of an entire world coming apart simultaneously. Drought and famine reduced the surplus that held the system together. Reduced surplus weakened military capacity. Weakened military capacity emboldened internal enemies and border raiders. Emboldened enemies forced the empire to spend what little it had. Disrupted trade cut off the resources that might have compensated. And populations in motion, the people we call the sea peoples, whether raiders or refugees or both, added violence and instability to a system that could no longer absorb it. No single one of these pressures needed to be fatal. But they did not arrive separately. They arrived together and they fed each other. This is the shape historians call systems collapse. A civilization does not have to be weak to fall this way. The Hittites were not weak. They had endured for 4 centuries. They had built stone cities, written legal codes, fought great powers to a standstill, negotiated the first surviving peace treaty in human history. Their sophistication was real. But sophistication and complexity, the very qualities that made them powerful, also made them dependent. Dependent on stable climate, on functioning trade, on the loyalty of distant vassals, on grain that had to travel long distances to feed a capital on a plateau. When the conditions that sustained that complexity shifted, the complexity itself became the mechanism of failure. The Hittite royal court in Hattusa's final years would have understood that things were going wrong. The letters exist to prove it. They were asking for help. They were sending warnings. What they could not see, what no one living inside a system can easily see, is when accumulating pressures reach the point where adaptation becomes impossible. They thought they were managing a difficult period. They did not know they were living at the end of their world. The gates of Hattusa were left open. The palaces were stripped. The fires were set. And within a generation the writing system the Hittites had used to record their treaties and their prayers and their desperate letters for grain was forgotten. Their very existence passed out of human memory. An empire that had called the Pharaoh of Egypt its equal disappeared so thoroughly that the ancient world that came after them did not know they had been there. This is where the long descent leads, not always to a violent end, not always to a single decisive moment. Sometimes it leads to a city stripped by its own people, a gate left open, and a silence that lasts 2,000 years. The Hittites believed their empire was permanent. They had reason to believe it. They were wrong, and they would not be the last.